They expected punishment. They expected humiliation. What they found instead was something they couldn't even process. The year was 1944. A train screeched to a halt in the American Midwest, and dozens of weary German prisoners of war stepped off the wooden cars, shackled by fear more than by iron. Their boots hit the gravel one by one, each soldier trying to stand tall despite exhaustion. They had been captured in North Africa, or in France, or during the Allied push through Italy. For months, Nazi propaganda had whispered the same warning into their ears. If you are taken prisoner by the Americans, you will suffer. You will starve. They have nothing. Their country is collapsing under war and Jewish corruption. You will envy the dead. And yet, the air was different here. Sweet, even. The POWs blinked against the afternoon light, and then their eyes fixed on something they thought was staged, a trick to break their spirit. Across the road stood a building with wide glass windows glowing in the sun. Inside they could see shelves lined with food. Not a few cans, not scraps, not thin loaves of black bread like back home. No, there were mountains of bread stacked neatly as if nobody here feared tomorrow. Meat hung behind a glass counter. Shiny fruits, as red and bright as Christmas ornaments, sat in perfect rows. A boy walked out of the store holding something cold and dripping, an ice cream cone, and the prisoners froze, staring. One German corporal muttered under his breath, This can't be real." For years, they had been told America was on its knees. Newspapers in Berlin shouted headlines, "America's economy is collapsing. Its cities are crime-ridden. Its people are starving under Roosevelt's lies." And yet, standing here in 1944, the very first thing these soldiers saw in captivity was abundance beyond imagination. One POW whispered, "Look at their children. They're fat. Not hungry, fat." Another muttered, "In Germany, even officers struggle to find butter." What was worse? The guards didn't even hide it. They let the prisoners stare. They wanted them to. Because in that silent moment, with no guns fired, no speeches shouted, the Americans had already won a deeper war. The war of belief. The German soldiers had endured nights of chewing stale bread crusts. They had marched on empty stomachs, watching their rations shrink each month. Even back home, wives and mothers lined up for hours to get a few grams of sugar, a slice of meat once a week. And now, here, in this small-town American street, there was food spilling over like it was nothing. And the cruelest part? This wasn't even New York City, or Chicago, or Los Angeles. This was a quiet town in Kansas, or Oklahoma, or Texas. Just a place where normal Americans lived, and even their normal was richer than anything Germans had ever known. A young boy licked his ice cream cone and stared at the prisoners. He looked no older than 10. His shirt was clean, his cheeks were round, and in his other hand, he held a bottle of something they had only heard rumors about, Coca-Cola. One POW officer turned his head, ashamed. Others stared openly, jaws tightening. Some laughed nervously, muttering in German that it had to be staged. But the ice cream was melting. The Coca-Cola fizzed. This wasn't a stage. And here's the question we'll answer in this story. How could a nation at war, fighting across 2 oceans, building more tanks and planes than the world had ever seen, still have supermarkets overflowing with food ice cream for children and luxuries that Germans hadn't seen in years? The German troops didn't know it yet, but this moment, stepping off that train, and seeing abundance with their own eyes, was more devastating than any weapon the Allies could have pointed at them. Because if America could fight this hard abroad while still living this well at home, Germany was doomed. But this was only the beginning. The supermarket was just the first shock. What happened inside the POW camps, the meals, the entertainment, the unexpected kindness, would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about the world. Imagine spending years of your life being told the same story. America is weak. America is broken. America is soft and lazy. Now imagine stepping onto foreign soil and finding the exact opposite. Staring you in the face. That's exactly what happened in 1944 when thousands of German soldiers, veterans of North Africa, Italy, and Normandy, were shipped across the Atlantic as prisoners of war. They weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting against an illusion carefully built by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine. For years, German newspapers, radio broadcasts, and speeches hammered home the same message. America was controlled by greedy businessmen and Jews. Its factories were inefficient, its workers lazy, its soldiers were soft, untrained, and unfit for a real fight. And most importantly, the American people were starving, desperate, and ready to collapse under the weight of war. One cartoon printed in 1942 showed an overweight, clueless American soldier dropping his rifle while German troops marched past him in perfect discipline. Another propaganda broadcast claimed U.S. citizens were lining up for bread as if the Depression had never ended. But these stories were more than exaggerations. They were survival tools. If German soldiers believed America had no strength, then they could keep fighting. By 1943, though, whispers started to creep in. German troops in Africa faced Sherman tanks that rolled forward with endless fuel. Luftwaffe pilots saw swarms of American planes filling the skies, more than they thought the U.S. could even build. Still, propaganda found a way to explain it away. America is using British weapons. America is being propped up by others. America can't sustain this. But when those same soldiers were captured and transported to America, the illusion crumbled in an instant. The supermarket wasn't just a building full of food. It was evidence. Hard, undeniable evidence that their leaders had lied to them for years. The POWs weren't allowed to step into the store that day. They were marched past it, their guards keeping them in line. But that glimpse was enough. One soldier whispered to another, "If this is a small town, what does New York look like?" The other shook his head. "I don't want to think about it." And here's the powerful truth. The shock didn't just stay with them for a few minutes. It followed them into the camps, into their conversations, and into their dreams at night. Some couldn't stop replaying the sight of shiny apples stacked higher than their heads. Others remembered the boy with the Coca-Cola, his cheeks glowing with health. One older sergeant confessed later in his diary, "I felt ashamed. We believed our nation was the most advanced. But in one look, I saw that America was a giant, and we were insects." When word spread among the POWs inside the camps, the reactions ranged from anger to despair. Some still clung to the belief it was a trick. Staged abundance meant to break their morale. But day after day, more cracks appeared. They saw farmers driving shiny tractors, fields stretching endlessly with corn and wheat. They heard about canneries and factories running day and night, producing food as if hunger didn't exist. They realized America's workers weren't starving. They were thriving, even while sending sons to war. What made it worse? The guards didn't boast. They didn't rub it in. They just treated it as normal life. And that normal was the real dagger in the chest. The Germans came expecting a nation in ruins. Instead, they found a country that seemed invincible, and if America could feed its people like this while building tanks, planes, and ships by the thousands, what chance did Germany really have? The train doors clattered open and the German POWs stepped into a world they had never imagined. It wasn't a grand city or a military base that greeted them. It was something far more disarming, small-town America. The streets were wide. Houses had lawns, trimmed and green. Front porches stretched lazily under the afternoon sun. And people, ordinary Americans, gathered along sidewalks to stare at the strange sight. Captured soldiers from Hitler's army, still in uniform, guarded but unharmed. For the Germans, it felt surreal. They had been told America was a land of chaos, crime, and poverty. Yet here, in a town they couldn't even pronounce, they saw peace, order, comfort. A woman in a floral dress clutched her daughter's hand as the prisoners marched past. The girl, no older than 8, sucked on a red lollipop, a piece of candy that would have been a treasure in Germany. A man leaned against his pickup truck chewing tobacco, nodding as if to say, "So these are the big, bad Nazis." And everywhere, the POWs noticed something missing: fear. These Americans weren't trembling at the sight of captured enemy soldiers. They weren't cursing, spitting, or throwing stones. They were curious. Some even looked bored, as if this was just another event in their quiet town. For German soldiers raised on images of Allied weakness, this was a devastating blow, because indifference can sometimes wound more than hatred. As the column of POWs marched, they passed diners with signs advertising steak dinners for $1.25. They passed a gas station where attendants pumped fuel without ration cards. They saw children with bicycles racing down sidewalks without a care. One German private whispered, "It looks like paradise." Another clenched his fists, muttering, "No, this can't last. It must be fake." But every detail contradicted the lie. The gas pumps kept running. The children's laughter was unforced. The food signs weren't painted just for show. And then came the most crushing sight of all: grocery stores. Behind one wide glass window, shelves groaned under the weight of goods. Loaves of bread, rolls, cakes, boxes of cereal, cans stacked in pyramids, labels bright and colorful. Frozen meats, milk bottles clinking in crates. In Germany, butter was rationed by the ounce. Meat was a luxury saved for Sundays. Coffee was a memory from before the war. But here, in this anonymous American town, there was too much to count. Some POWs couldn't even look. Others stared until guards barked at them to keep moving. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "It was not the soldiers or the weapons that defeated us in that moment. It was the bread in the windows. We saw it and we knew." What made this even more powerful was that nobody explained it. No officer gave a speech. No leaflet was handed out. The message was silent yet deafening. This is our life. This is normal. And if this is normal for us in wartime, your leaders have lied to you about everything. And here's where the story hooks even deeper, because the supermarkets were only the beginning. The real shocks came later, inside the POW camps where Germans expected cruelty, and instead found something even harder to accept: kindness. But before they reached the camps, one more surprise awaited them. Something cold, something sweet, something that made them question whether they were prisoners at all. Guards gave brisk orders, and there it was, the building that would shatter everything they thought they knew. A supermarket, not just a shop. Not just a market stall like back home, but a temple of abundance, its glass windows glowing with light and color. Inside, the first thing they noticed was bread. Not a few loaves, not a basket behind the counter. Rows upon rows. White bread, soft and thick, stacked higher than the prisoners' heads. Rolls of every shape and size. Cakes, pies, cookies, desserts that German civilians hadn't seen in years. One POW whispered in disbelief, "We ration flour by the spoonful. And they make cake?" The words spread like sparks. Prisoners began murmuring, trying to count the shelves, trying to imagine what it would be like to touch even one loaf. Behind a glass counter, meat gleamed red and fresh, cut thick in slabs. Bacon strips curled in neat piles. Sausages hung in links, too many to number, and then they saw something even more incredible: coffee. In Germany, coffee had disappeared early in the war, replaced by bitter substitutes made from roasted barley or acorns. But here, in 1944 America, bags of coffee beans sat casually on the shelves, as if war hadn't touched them at all. And sugar, white sugar, sold by the pound, in sacks so large they looked like treasure chests. One sergeant shook his head, muttering, "If this is true, then everything we were told was a lie." But it wasn't just the food. It was the color. Labels in bright red and yellow. Fruits stacked like jewels. Oranges, bananas, apples polished to a shine. Germans back home had forgotten what bananas even tasted like. Children grew up never having seen one. Yet here they were, sitting in piles like they meant nothing. A POW later wrote, "The colors hurt my eyes. Our markets were gray, black, brown. This was a rainbow, and each color reminded us of what we had lost." The American guards didn't explain. They didn't boast. They simply let the prisoners look, and that silence spoke louder than any speech could. Because the Germans could not dismiss this as theater. It wasn't staged. It was too ordinary, too casual. Housewives pushed carts through the aisles. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, begging for candy. A man at the counter complained about prices, not shortages. This was life in wartime America. Normal life. Some POWs laughed bitterly, shaking their heads in denial. Others stared in silence, lips pressed tight, their pride cracking with each glance. One private whispered, "If this is real, we cannot win." Another, younger soldier, muttered angrily, "It's staged. It must be staged." But even he couldn't take his eyes off the bananas, and then came the final insult. Or the final mercy, depending on how you saw it. The guards marched the POWs away, not letting them touch a single loaf or taste a single slice. The abundance was real, yes, but it wasn't for them. Not yet. That night in their holding camp, the supermarket was all they could talk about. Bread, coffee, sugar, bananas. But the Americans weren't finished shocking them. Because the next day, these soldiers would be given something no prisoner expected, food that tasted like home, and luxuries they thought were only for generals. Ice cream, Coca-Cola. And a truth that hit harder than any bomb. In America, even prisoners ate better than German civilians. In Germany, bread was life. Every ration card measured it by grams, not loaves. Mothers cut slices thinner and thinner so children could eat one more day. Soldiers on the front carried hard, black loaves, dense, sour, meant to last weeks, not to taste good. And now, staring through glass in a small American town, these POWs saw mountains of bread. White bread, soft and airy, stacked high enough to feed an entire battalion. Rolls glistening with butter. Cakes covered in frosting. One prisoner later said, "I felt my chest tighten. It was not hunger. It was shame. We were told they starved. But they lived better than kings." Next came the meat. Thick cuts, red and marbled, piled in butcher cases. Sausages that would have been a festival treat back home hung like decorations. In Germany, by 1944, meat was almost gone. A family might get a few ounces of horse meat or scraps once a week. But here, even in wartime, America had too much to count. A German officer muttered under his breath, "This is their ration. This is their wartime ration?" No one answered. The silence was heavier than any words, but the true dagger was coffee. For Germans, coffee had become a memory. By 1941, it was replaced by ersatz, fake coffee brewed from barley, chicory, or roasted acorns. Bitter, weak, a cruel reminder of what had been lost. Yet in America, coffee was sold by the pound, stacked in neat cans with shiny labels. Housewives strolled past carrying bags of it like it was nothing. One POW whispered almost to himself, "They drink real coffee, every day." His friend shook his head, refusing to believe it. But the smell drifting from the cafe across the street didn't lie. Back home, ration cards were shrinking every month. By 1944, even butter and eggs were rare. Sugar was almost mythical. Ordinary families bartered, scraped, and begged for scraps. The prisoners knew this too well. They carried hunger in their bones. And here was the unspoken truth. The war wasn't just being fought on the battlefield. It was being fought in grocery stores, in farms, in factories, and America had already won that war. Not all of them admitted it out loud. Pride ran deep. Some soldiers clenched their fists, muttering that it had to be staged, a trick. But late at night, back in their barracks, the whispers came. "Did you see the sugar? They have more bread than Berlin. If their civilians live like this, what chance do we have?" And those whispers spread. fast, faster than propaganda could contain. But the Americans weren't done, because bread and meat in store windows was one thing. What came next was far worse, or far better, depending on how you looked at it. The Germans weren't just going to stare at abundance anymore. They were going to taste it. And the first bite wasn't bread, or meat, or even coffee. It was something far sweeter, something that, for a German prisoner, was almost unthinkable. Ice cream. The Germans didn't speak much as they marched past the supermarket. But silence doesn't mean nothing was happening. Inside, entire worlds were collapsing. Some soldiers laughed nervously. A corporal muttered, "It's fake. They staged it for us." He said it loudly enough for his men to hear, trying to keep pride intact, but no one answered. Because deep down, they knew the truth. Children don't fake licking ice cream cones. Housewives don't fake pulling cans of coffee off shelves. This wasn't a theater show. It was reality. For many, the supermarket wasn't just abundance. It was humiliation. Germany had prided itself on discipline, efficiency, sacrifice. Yet here, their enemies, the people they were told were weak, lazy, and decadent, had managed to create something far more powerful. Comfort. One sergeant lowered his head, whispering, "My wife waits in line for 2 hours for half a loaf. And here, they eat cake." The words cut like a blade. None of them had a reply. Anger came next. Not at the Americans, but at their own leaders. They had been promised a 1,000-year Reich. They had been promised victory, prosperity, and glory. Yet here they were, prisoners, staring at abundance they had been told didn't exist. Some clenched their fists. Others spat in the dirt. But none could erase the image of bread stacked higher than their heads, meat shining behind glass, or sugar piled like gold. That night, in the wooden barracks of their first POW camp, the silence broke. Whispers carried through the dark. "Did you see the oranges? Coffee, real coffee. Imagine, if they live like this while fighting a war, then Germany is finished." Others argued, clinging to denial. It was a trick. They put all their food in one place just to fool us. But those voices grew weaker each night. Reality was stronger than pride. The next day, guards handed out food, bread, meat, and to the POWs' shock, ice cream. It wasn't a dream. Prisoners, enemies, eating something German children hadn't tasted in years. The cold sweetness on their tongues was more than flavor. It was proof. Proof that America's abundance wasn't staged. Proof that prisoners here were treated better than civilians back home. A young private stared into his tin cup, whispering, "Even our children. They don't eat this." His friend looked at him, eyes hollow. "No, they starve. And here, even prisoners eat like kings." No one said it out loud, but the truth hung in the air. Germany could never win this war. Not against tanks, planes, and ships, but against bread, against coffee, against ice cream, against a nation that could fight across 2 oceans and still feed its children better than Germany could in peacetime. But the shocks weren't over. Because soon, the POWs would learn that American abundance wasn't just about food. It was about entertainment, freedom, and something that struck even deeper, a society where the very people Nazi propaganda called inferior held positions of power they had never imagined. To understand why German soldiers were stunned by American supermarkets, you have to see where they came from. Because in 1944, Germany wasn't just losing on the battlefield. It was starving at home. Every German civilian carried a ration card, a flimsy piece of paper that controlled survival. It didn't matter how much money you had in your pocket. Without a stamp, you couldn't buy. Bread was cut to ounces. Meat shrank to grams. Butter nearly vanished. Sugar was a rare treasure, saved for children's birthdays. Mothers would line up for hours, clutching ration cards, hoping the store wouldn't run out before their turn came. And when it did, they went home with only half of what they needed. One diary entry from Berlin read, "Today, 3 hours for half a loaf." Tomorrow, maybe nothing. The shortages weren't just about less food. They were about fake food, coffee replaced by roasted barley, chicory, or even acorns. Flour stretched, with sawdust or potato starch, butter replaced by thin, margarine that tasted of chemicals. Germans joked bitterly that ersatz, the word for substitute, was the most common flavor of the war. But it wasn't really a joke. It was survival. In Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, cities battered by bombs, food became even scarcer. Families bartered on the black market, trading jewelry for potatoes, cigarettes for bread. Children's bellies swelled with malnutrition. Soldiers' wives wrote desperate letters to the front. Send anything you can, even crumbs, and in 1944, as the Allies advanced, hunger deepened. Rail lines were destroyed. Farms couldn't keep up. The Reich's promise of endless abundance was revealed as a hollow lie. The POWs who stared into American supermarkets weren't imagining their hunger. They had lived it. On the front lines, rations shrank too. Soldiers chewed on black bread so hard it chipped teeth. Meat was salted and tough, meant to last, not to taste good. Coffee was watery and bitter. Some stole from civilians. Others traded whatever they had for a bite of sausage. One soldier wrote, "We march on empty stomachs. Hunger follows every step. When I dream of bread." And now, in 1944, those same soldiers stood in front of American glass windows filled with food they hadn't seen in years. Real bread, real butter, real coffee, real sugar. It wasn't just shocking. It was humiliating. Because while their families starved, while their comrades wasted away on the Eastern Front, here in America, children wasted food, dogs ate scraps that would have been feasts in Germany, and even prisoners were given ice cream. In their hearts, every German soldier asked the same question. If this is what America looks like in war, what will Germany look like in peace? And the answer was already clear. Germany could never match this. Not in food, not in production, not in life itself, and that realization was more terrifying than any battlefield defeat. The Germans weren't just shocked by what they saw. They were haunted by one question: how? How could America fight across two oceans, against Germany in Europe, against Japan in the Pacific, and still feed its people better than Germany ever had, even in peace? The answer was as vast as the country itself. First, there was the land. The United States in the 1940s was a farming powerhouse. From the wheat fields of Kansas to the cornfields of Iowa, from dairy farms in Wisconsin to fruit orchards in California, America had food in every direction. By 1944, American farmers were producing record amounts. Tractors roared across fields while German farms relied on horses. Fertilizers and mechanization meant yields per acre were higher than Europe had ever seen. One German POW stared at a Kansas wheat field stretching to the horizon and muttered, "We cannot win against this. It is endless." But food was only half the story. The other half was industry. American factories didn't just build tanks, planes, and ships. They also built refrigerators, canning machines, conveyor belts, and packaging plants that kept grocery stores full. A Ford factory could churn out a bomber in less than an hour. And at the same time, America's food industry was mass-producing everything from canned soup to frozen meat. In Germany, families scraped for scraps. In America, factories made it possible to sell 57 varieties of canned beans while still fighting a world war. Then came logistics, the science of moving goods. German soldiers prided themselves on discipline, but American supply chains ran like veins of steel. Highways carried trucks filled with bread, meat, sugar, and coffee. Railways never stopped. Ships brought bananas and coffee beans from Latin America. To German eyes, it was incomprehensible. Their own army starved on the Eastern Front, waiting weeks for rations to arrive. But here, in America, a small-town supermarket had more variety than Berlin itself. There was another secret: America's workforce. In Germany, bombing raids crippled production. Men were conscripted. Women struggled to keep families alive. In America, women stepped into factories in record numbers. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda, she was real. Housewives became welders. Farmers' daughters drove tractors. Every pair of hands added to the machine of abundance. And because America wasn't being bombed at home, production only grew stronger. Here's the part that stunned the Germans most. For America, war didn't mean scarcity. It meant expansion. Factories grew. Farms produced more. Grocery stores didn't shrink. They swelled. Even rationing in America looked luxurious compared to Germany. An American ration card still allowed meat, sugar, coffee, butter, canned goods, things Germans hadn't seen in years. And that was the deepest humiliation, because if this was rationing, what would plenty look like? It wasn't just about bread or coffee anymore. It was about what abundance represented, a system that worked. A people who believed they could outproduce any enemy. A country so confident in its strength that it could give ice cream to its prisoners. And for the German POWs, the truth settled like a stone in the stomach. If America could live like this in wartime, Germany had already lost. It's one thing to see abundance, it's another thing to taste it. For the German POWs in 1944, that moment came sooner than they expected. It began with something simple. At one camp, a U.S. guard walked past the prisoners with a wooden tray. On it, tin cups filled with something cold and pale. The POWs stared. It wasn't soup. It wasn't coffee. It looked soft, sweet, alien. Ice cream, the guard said almost casually, as if it were nothing. As if even prisoners deserved dessert. One prisoner lifted his spoon hesitantly. The cold shocked his tongue. Then came the sweetness, richer than anything he'd tasted in years. He closed his eyes, almost ashamed of how much it moved him. Another soldier whispered, "Our children. They've never tasted this." Not once. A murmur spread through the barracks. Prisoners laughed nervously, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Others simply ate in silence, each bite eroding years of propaganda. But the real blow came later. Guards handed out bottles, dark glass, with labels the POWs had only heard about in rumors. Coca-Cola. Some prisoners had seen it in Nazi propaganda posters, mocked as a decadent American drink, but here it was, sweating in their hands, fizzing as they twisted off the caps. The first sip burned their throats, sweet, sharp, alive with bubbles. For a moment, they forgot they were prisoners. For a moment, they were just men, tasting the future. One soldier put down his bottle, staring at it in disbelief. Even as prisoners, we eat and drink better than our families back home. The words spread like fire, because it was true. In bombed-out Berlin, mothers scraped mold off bread. Children chewed watery cabbage soup. Sugar was a ghost. Coffee was gone. Ice cream was a memory. And here, in America, the enemy gave it freely to men who had sworn to kill them. This wasn't generosity. This wasn't kindness. It was something far more devastating. Normalcy. The guards didn't act like they were doing the POWs a favor. They acted like it was routine, like ice cream and Coca-Cola were so ordinary that even captured Germans should have them. To the prisoners, it was humiliating, because it proved, beyond denial, that Germany's war was already lost. That night, as they lay in their bunks, the POWs whispered about it endlessly. Do they really have this every day? What else do they have that we don't? How can we fight a country that eats like kings and still builds 100,000 planes? Some refuse to drink the last drops of their Coca-Cola, hiding the bottles as souvenirs. Others couldn't stop replaying the taste in their minds, wondering if their wives and children would ever know it. And here's the cruel irony. Ice cream and Coca-Cola were just the beginning. Because the Americans weren't only going to feed their prisoners, they were going to entertain them, movies, music, baseball games, even libraries. For the POWs, the greatest shock wasn't that America was rich. It was that America treated its enemies better than Germany treated its own. The supermarket was one shock. The ice cream and Coca-Cola were another. But what broke the German prisoners even more wasn't what they saw or ate. It was what they whispered in the dark. The barracks creaked with every shift on the bunks. Outside, guards paced under lantern light. Inside, dozens of German soldiers lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thoughts louder than their breathing. And then the whispers began. One young private whispered to the man above him, "Do you think they really live like this every day?" The older soldier didn't answer at first. Finally, he muttered, "They must. You can't fake that much food. Not for this long." Across the room, another voice chimed in, sharp and angry. "It's propaganda. Don't believe it. They staged it to humiliate us." But no one replied, because deep down, everyone knew the truth. Children don't fake fat cheeks. Factories don't fake smoke pouring from their chimneys. And ice cream melting on your tongue isn't an illusion. Some POWs clung desperately to pride. They boasted that Germany still had the best tanks, the best rockets, the best discipline. Others laughed bitterly. And what will we fuel them with? Sausages? We don't even have bread. The room fell silent. Pride was heavy, but hunger was heavier. Several POWs talked about letters home. They imagined writing, "They give us ice cream. They give us Coca-Cola. They give us meat. More than you've seen in years." But they all knew the truth. Those words would never pass censors. Letters were scanned, rewritten, sanitized. The Reich couldn't allow such stories to spread, so the truth lived only in whispers. Then came the question no one wanted to ask, but everyone felt in their gut. If they live like this in war, what happens when the war is over? No one answered, because the answer was obvious. Germany had gambled on a short war, a war of lightning victories. But America had settled in for the long haul, and still had more than enough to eat, drink, and waste. Outside the camp fences, music drifted from a nearby farmhouse radio. Big band swing full of brass and laughter carried through the night air, one POW muttered, almost to himself. They listened to music, while we listened to bombs. The others stared into the dark, each man lost in his own humiliation. And here's what twisted the knife even deeper. The POWs soon realized that America wasn't going to keep them locked away in silence. No, the guards had something else planned, something no German could have imagined. They were going to give the prisoners not just food, but entertainment, movies, books, baseball games. Because America wasn't just showing its strength with weapons and bread, it was showing its strength with freedom. When words can't be spoken aloud, men turn to paper. That's exactly what the German POWs did. They picked up pens, sat at rough wooden desks, and tried to put into sentences the things they had seen and tasted in America. Some wrote to wives, "I am safe. The Americans treat us well. Too well, in fact. You wouldn't believe it." Some wrote to parents. "Mother, they give us meat every day, coffee, even sugar. Can you imagine?" Others wrote to friends. "I tasted ice cream yesterday. It was cold, sweet. I thought of you and our walks in summer. Do you remember?" The words spilled out, a mixture of disbelief, relief, and guilt. But those letters never arrived as written. Every sheet of paper passed through U.S. Army censors. Anything that revealed too much, about camp conditions, about food, about comforts, was cut. Whole sentences disappeared. Lines turned into black streaks. Some letters were rewritten entirely, boiled down to the basics. "I am alive. I am well. Do not worry." The Germans could write, but their families would never know the truth. This was no accident. The Allies understood that information was a weapon. If German families learned their captured sons were eating better in America than they were at home, morale would collapse. If civilians learned the Reich's lies had been exposed, rebellion could spread. So the truth stayed trapped inside the camps, whispered among prisoners, scratched into censored pages, locked inside memories. For many, the censorship was unbearable. One soldier slammed his pen down. "What's the point? They'll never read it. They'll never know." Another sighed. "Perhaps that is mercy. How could I tell my wife I eat meat while she starves?" The guilt was crushing. Eating ice cream as a prisoner while imagining your child at home crying from hunger. It was a wound deeper than bullets. Yet some truths escaped, not in letters, but in tone. A wife in Hamburg later recalled receiving a letter from her husband in 1944. It said little more than, "I am alive." But the handwriting was steady. The words oddly calm. She realized then. He wasn't starving. He wasn't suffering. Somehow, he was being treated well. Even censored silence spoke louder than lies. The Germans inside those camps now carried a forbidden truth. America was not weak, starving, or collapsing. It was thriving. And soon their sense of humiliation would deepen further, because the POW camps didn't just provide food. They provided entertainment, movies flickering on white sheets, radios playing jazz, even baseball games under the summer sun. The enemy wasn't just feeding them. The enemy was letting them live. For the German POWs, every day in America felt like stepping into a contradiction, because nothing in their lives had prepared them for this clash of worlds. German discipline and sacrifice against American comfort and freedom. They expected cages, shackles, beatings. What they got instead was a camp that looked, at least to them, almost like a small village. Wooden barracks, clean bunks, a mess hall, a library, even sports fields. One prisoner whispered to another on the first day, "Are we prisoners or guests?" The guard overheard and smirked. Prisoners. Don't forget it. And yet, compared to what German camps gave to their own captives, the difference was staggering. Back home, German soldiers were drilled to exhaustion. Rules were absolute. Punishment was brutal. Here, American guards enforced discipline, but with a shocking degree of leniency. If a POW kept his head down, did his work, and followed orders, he was left alone. No shouting, no endless drills. Sometimes guards even joked with them, something unthinkable under German officers. This wasn't softness, it was confidence, because America didn't need to prove its strength by cruelty. The supermarkets, the ice cream, the Coca-Cola had already done that. Every day, the POWs were fed meals that would have shamed Germany's own soldiers. Stew with real meat, potatoes, fresh bread, sometimes even desserts. One German officer muttered during lunch, "I don't understand. Why waste this on us?" A guard replied casually, "It's not waste, it's policy. We'll see." That was the word. America had so much abundance that feeding its prisoners well wasn't generosity. It was procedure. But comfort brought something unexpected, unease, because the POWs couldn't reconcile what they were experiencing with what they had been told. In Germany, their propaganda machine had painted America as a crumbling empire of crime, hunger, and chaos. Yet here they were, sitting on clean benches, eating better than their families back home, while guards tossed baseballs and laughed like life had never changed. The contradiction gnawed at them. Some prisoners still clung to denial. It's temporary. When Germany wins, America will starve. Others laughed bitterly. Wins? Against this? Look around you. At night, the whispers grew darker. If this is how they treat us, imagine how their own people live. Our wives queue for bread. And here, even prisoners get dessert. It wasn't the guards, or the fences, or the work that broke the Germans' pride. It was the ease, the casualness, the fact that America didn't even have to try to impress them. The abundance was so natural, so normal that it didn't need explanation. And that, more than anything, proved to the POWs that their Reich was doomed. But the Germans hadn't seen everything yet, because soon they would encounter something that their propaganda machine had prepared them for, and completely lied, about African American troops. Men whom the Nazis had called inferior. Men whom German officers swore could never stand as equals. And yet, in America, they wore uniforms. They carried rifles, and sometimes they even guarded the camps. For the POWs, this was a revelation they could not process. For years, Nazi propaganda drilled the same poison into German minds, that only the so-called Aryan race was strong, capable, and worthy of command. All others, they were told, were weak, inferior, subhuman. And yet in 1944, behind the fences of POW camps in America, German prisoners saw something that shattered that lie forever. It began with footsteps, boots on gravel, guards changing shifts. A group of POWs turned to look and froze. Standing before them were African American soldiers, rifles slung over their shoulders, U.S. Army uniforms pressed and proud. One German corporal blinked in disbelief. They let them wear uniforms? Another muttered, louder than he meant to. Impossible. But there they were, guarding German prisoners of war. Not as servants, not as laborers, but as soldiers. For the POWs, this was more than a surprise. It was a collision. Nazi propaganda had told them black men were incapable of discipline, incapable of intelligence, incapable of power. Yet here they were, commanding authority, rifles in hand, guarding the very soldiers who once boasted of their master race. One young POW whispered to his comrade, "If this is true, then everything we were told was false." The African American soldiers didn't need to shout or threaten. Their presence alone was enough. They walked the perimeter with the same calm confidence as any white guard. They enforced rules with the same authority. And for some Germans, that simple equality was more shocking than the food, the supermarkets, or even the ice cream. Because it wasn't just abundance America had, it was a different vision of society. For men raised on the belief of superiority, this was humiliation of the deepest kind. One German officer turned away, refusing to look. Another clenched his fists, muttering curses under his breath. But neither could erase the fact that reality stood in front of them, boots on gravel, rifle in hand. And reality didn't bend to ideology. At night, the question spread like wildfire in the barracks. If they trust these men with guns, what else do they trust them with? Do they really fight on the front lines? Do they command? And when the answers came, yes, they fought, yes, they commanded, yes, they were equals in the American Army, the POWs had no words. Because if America was strong enough to fight a world war while lifting up the very people Nazi ideology tried to erase, what did that say about the future of Germany's so-called Reich? It wasn't a battle. No shots were fired. No tanks rolled. But for many German POWs, seeing African American troops in uniform was the moment they understood that their leaders had lied about everything. Food had humiliated them. Coca-Cola had astonished them. But this broke their pride. Because the war wasn't just about armies. It was about ideas. And in that moment, Germany's ideas crumbled. But the Americans weren't done surprising them. Because after food, after ice cream, after Coca-Cola, after seeing the lies of ideology collapse, the POWs were given something they could hardly believe. Food was shocking. Coca-Cola was unbelievable. But what came next left the German prisoners completely unprepared, because the Americans didn't just feed their enemies, they entertained them. One evening, guards set up a projector. A white sheet stretched between two poles became the screen. The POWs gathered, whispering in confusion. What is this? A speech? A lecture? And then the reel began to spin. Black and white images flickered in the night. A cowboy galloped across the screen. An orchestra swelled. The prisoners gasped, then laughed. Real laughter, the kind they hadn't felt in years. For a few hours, war vanished. They weren't prisoners. They weren't enemies. They were just men watching a movie under the stars. One soldier muttered, "In Germany, even civilians don't have this anymore." Days later, it was music. Radios in the mess hall played jazz and swing. Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, Duke Ellington. At first, the Germans frowned. Jazz had been banned back home, condemned as degenerate. But here, the rhythm was impossible to resist. Feet tapped, heads nodded. Some prisoners even hummed along. It was more than music. It was freedom. The sound of a culture that celebrated life instead of rationing it. But the greatest shock came on the baseball field. One afternoon, guards tossed gloves and bats onto the dirt. "Play," they said simply. The POWs looked at each other, baffled. Then, slowly, cautiously, they picked up the bats. Guards explained the rules. Before long, German prisoners were swinging at pitches, running bases, sliding in the dust. And the strangest thing? The guards cheered for them. It was sport, not war. Laughter instead of bullets. One German officer shook his head afterward. "They let us play games while our own people starve." For men who grew up under Nazi discipline, where leisure was rationed as tightly as food and laughter was seen as weakness, this was unimaginable. Here, even in captivity, life had more color, more joy, more freedom than life in Germany had in victory. And that realization was devastating, because if prisoners could experience entertainment in America, what must life be like for ordinary citizens? At night, the barracks echoed with hushed voices. Do you think their civilians live like this too? If they can afford to waste time on games, what else can they afford? How can we fight a people who live like this? There was no answer, because there didn't need to be one. But America's greatest weapon wasn't baseball, or movies, or even ice cream. It was the silent, crushing realization that Germany was doomed, and many POWs began to admit it to themselves. The next stage wasn't about food or leisure, it was about acceptance. The silent realization that the Reich was collapsing, and that their leaders had lied to them all along. Every prisoner of war remembers the moment they stopped believing in victory. For the Germans in America in 1944, it didn't happen on the battlefield. It happened in silence, in the barracks, at the mess tables, during long stares through barbed wire fences. It was the moment when pride gave way to truth. Every day offered new proof. Fresh bread in the mess hall, coffee poured steaming into cups, guards tossing baseballs laughing without fear, radios playing music that Germany had silenced. It wasn't just the abundance, it was the ease, the casualness. America wasn't straining to survive, it was thriving, and that was the dagger in the heart. At first, denial had been strong. Some POWs whispered, "It's staged. They're showing us illusions." But illusions don't last weeks. Illusions don't serve hot meals 3 times a day. Illusions don't build libraries in POW camps or let prisoners play baseball. By late 1944, denial was dead. One soldier admitted in his diary, "I no longer believe in victory. Not because of weapons, but because of bread, because of Coca-Cola, because of laughter." With realization came shame. They thought of their wives waiting in bread lines, their children chewing watery cabbage soup. They imagined their families in bombed-out cities, cold and hungry, while they, prisoners, ate ice cream. Some POWs refused dessert out of guilt. Others rationed it themselves, saving sugar packets or bread crusts as if somehow that would balance the scales. But it didn't. The shame lingered. The guards didn't need to lecture them. America's strength spoke in silence. One POW later said, "We saw the factories, we saw the food, we saw the freedom, and in those moments the war was already over for us." It wasn't tanks or planes that broke them. It was the everyday reality that Germany could never match. Historians call it material superiority. The POWs called it something else, humiliation. Because to them, every cup of coffee, every movie under the stars, every baseball game wasn't just kindness, it was proof. Proof that their Reich was crumbling while America was rising like a giant. And that realization spread quietly, like a virus. Not shouted, not written, but whispered in bunks, admitted in glances, accepted in silence. But the war wasn't over yet, and for the POWs, the final shocks still awaited. The moment when Germany itself collapsed, when surrender became reality, and when many of these same prisoners would face a choice: return to a ruined homeland, or stay in the land that had once been their enemy. Because for some, America's supermarkets and ice cream cones weren't just a humiliation. They were a promise. In May 1945, the guns fell silent. The Reich was no more. Hitler was dead. Berlin lay in ruins. And for the German POWs in America, a new question hung in the air. Do we go home? When news of surrender reached the camps, reactions were mixed. Some POWs cheered quietly, grateful the killing was done. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to imagine a Germany without the Reich. But all of them wondered what awaited them back home. And the answer, when it came, was grim. Letters began to trickle in. Cities bombed to rubble. Families displaced. Food scarcer than ever. One prisoner received a letter from his wife. We boil grass for soup. The children cry every night. Please, if you come home, bring bread. Bread. After all they had seen in America, the word cut like a blade. Repatriation didn't happen overnight. Many POWs stayed in American camps well into 1946. During that time, they worked on farms, read books, played baseball, even learned English. Some began to dread going home. What if home is worse than here? One whispered to another. And when the trains finally carried them back across the Atlantic, the sight that greeted them was worse than they feared. Germany was rubble. Cities like Dresden, Cologne, and Hamburg were unrecognizable. Seas of bricks, shattered windows, collapsed churches. Food was nearly gone. Women bartered jewelry for potatoes. Children stood barefoot in the streets. Old men scavenged garbage for scraps. One POW, stepping off the train in Frankfurt, muttered bitterly, "In America, even prisoners ate better than this." The memories haunted them. They remembered the supermarket shelves, the smell of fresh coffee, the fizz of Coca-Cola. They remembered ice cream melting on their tongues, baseball games under the sun, movies projected on white sheets. And now they looked at their homeland, starving, broken, beaten, and the contrast was unbearable. For some, it bred despair. For others, it sparked envy. And for a few, it planted a seed. What if I could live like that in America? But along with envy came guilt. Many POWs returned to families who had lost everything. Wives who had aged 10 years and 2, children who had grown up without fathers, mothers who had buried sons. How could they speak of ice cream, of Coca-Cola, of baseball? They didn't. They kept it inside, because the truth was too cruel to share. But not all of them stayed silent forever. Some POWs made a decision that would change their lives. They would not return to Germany at all. They would stay in the very country that had once been their enemy. When the war ended, most German POWs prepared for the long, uncertain journey home. But not all of them. Some looked at the barbed wire, the guards, the camp routines, and realized something astonishing. They didn't want to leave. The reasons were simple, yet profound. They had seen a country untouched by war, cities still standing, stores still full, families still eating together at dinner tables without fear of bombs overhead. They had tasted bread without ration cards, coffee without substitutes, ice cream without guilt, and now, facing the choice between returning to rubble in Germany or starting fresh in the land of plenty, some prisoners quietly thought, why go back at all? While in captivity, POWs were often sent to work on American farms or in local industries. To their surprise, they weren't treated with cruelty. Farmers offered meals, sometimes even invited them into their homes. They learned English words, shook hands with Americans, and saw children laugh without fear. One POW recalled, "We came expecting hatred. Instead, we found kindness. I realized then that I wanted my children to grow up here, not in ruins." By 1946 and 1947, hundreds of German POWs petitioned to remain in the United States. Some married American women. Others were sponsored by farmers who valued their work ethic. The U.S. Army, wary but pragmatic, allowed many to apply for residency. In time, some even became citizens. Imagine the shock in small American towns when a former German soldier became part of the community. One ex-POW opened a bakery in Wisconsin, using recipes from his homeland. Another became a farmer in Texas, planting wheat on land that looked like the plains of Europe. Neighbors who once stared at them with suspicion soon greeted them with waves, handshakes, and even friendship. For these men, America's abundance was no longer a humiliation. It was salvation. One former POW later said, "In Germany, I saw only ruins. In America, I saw a future. That is why I stayed." And yet, behind their gratitude was a shadow, the memory of comrades who returned to starvation, of families they left behind in broken cities, of the Reich that had promised them everything and delivered only rubble. But the story doesn't end with those who stayed. Because for those who returned, the memory of American abundance never left them. And that memory of supermarkets, ice cream, and Coca-Cola became a seed that would grow into something far larger: Germany's post-war admiration and imitation of America itself. The shock of supermarkets in 1944 wasn't just a moment in captivity. It was the beginning of a legacy that would shape Europe for decades to come. The war ended. The camps emptied. The barbed wire fences came down. But for thousands of German POWs, one image never left them: the sight of American supermarkets overflowing with food in the middle of war. When the men finally returned to Germany, they brought those memories with them. They remembered Coca-Cola bottles sweating in the summer heat. They remembered ice cream melting on tin spoons. They remembered shelves stacked with bread, meat, and coffee. And when they stepped into their ruined cities, rubble, hunger, ration cards, the contrast cut them open. One ex-POW recalled, "I came home to ruins. My family lived in a basement with rats, and yet I could not forget America's markets. It haunted me." Many didn't dare speak openly about what they had seen. The wounds of war were too raw. Talking about America's abundance felt like betrayal. But silently, admiration grew. In conversations whispered between friends, in diaries tucked away in drawers, in the memories passed down to children, the same thought repeated: America was strong because it could feed its people. And then, in 1948, that memory became reality. The Marshall Plan poured American aid into Europe. Ships arrived carrying wheat, sugar, coffee, chocolate, even powdered milk. For German children, it was their first taste of chewing gum, their first sip of real hot cocoa. To those who had once been POWs, the connection was clear. This was the abundance they had seen in America's supermarkets, now landing on German soil. It wasn't just food. It was proof that America's way of life could rebuild a broken continent. By the 1950s, Coca-Cola was no longer a prisoner's shock. It was a symbol of Germany's new future. Bottling plants opened in West Germany. Ads filled streets with smiling faces holding glass bottles. The drink that once humiliated German soldiers in POW camps became a badge of modernity, of prosperity, of belonging to the New World Order. One historian later wrote, "America didn't conquer Germany with tanks. It conquered it with supermarkets and Coca-Cola." The POWs who had seen America firsthand carried those lessons into rebuilding their own country when West Germany's economic miracle began in the 1950s. It was fueled by the same principles: industry, abundance, supermarkets, choice. The memories of ration cards and ersatz coffee faded. In their place rose gleaming stores, stocked shelves, and the quiet echo of what those POWs had once seen through American glass windows in 1944. Decades later, some former POWs admitted the truth in interviews. "We lost the war the day we saw America's supermarkets. We just didn't know it yet, because it wasn't just bread. It wasn't just coffee. It wasn't just ice cream. It was the realization that America's strength wasn't only in weapons. It was in the everyday. In supermarkets, in music, in baseball, in freedom. But history has a way of forgetting the small details. And so much of this story, The shock of bread, the taste of Coca-Cola, the laughter over baseball again has been buried in diaries, memoirs, and fading memories. Before we end, we need to look at those forgotten stories, the fragments of truth scribbled in notebooks and whispered in interviews, to understand just how deeply America's abundance scarred and inspired its enemies. History is usually told in numbers. How many planes built, how many battles fought, how many lives lost. But sometimes the truth hides in smaller things: a torn diary, a scribbled note, a memory passed down in whispers. For German POWs in America, those small stories revealed the deepest shock of all. One diary, smuggled back to Germany, read, "Today they served us bread so soft I thought it a dream. I tasted butter for the first time in years. Later we were given ice cream. Ice cream! While my children at home eat soup of cabbage water. How can I explain this to them?" The sergeant never did explain. The diary was hidden in a box, discovered decades later. Another prisoner drafted a letter to his wife. "Dearest Anna, they give us meat here, coffee, even sugar. I feel ashamed as I write this, knowing you stand in line for hours. Forgive me, for I eat while you starve." The letter was stopped by censors, never delivered. Anna never knew. Years later, a private published his memoirs. He described his first Coca-Cola like this: "The fizz startled me. The sweetness stung. It was unlike anything I had tasted. And in that moment I realized our defeat. Because if America could give this to prisoners, what could it give its own people?" His words spread long after the war, a reminder that defeat wasn't just on the battlefield, but in a bottle. Interviews decades later revealed the same theme. One former POW told a historian, "We were not beaten by weapons. We were beaten by supermarkets." Another said, "I never hated America. I envied it." Their voices, shaky with age, carried the weight of memories that had never faded. But many stories never made it to paper. Some POWs buried their shame, never telling wives or children what they had seen. Others feared their neighbors would call them traitors if they spoke admiringly of America. So the truth lived quietly, in glances, in silences, in the haunted look of men who once fought for the Reich but dreamed, secretly, of Coca-Cola and ice cream. And that brings us to the last, most important part of this story, because this isn't just about bread or coffee. It isn't just about propaganda or ration cards. It's about what it all meant, how supermarkets and abundance became America's most powerful weapon, and why. German POWs realized too late that no army on earth could defeat it. Wars are usually remembered in terms of battles: Stalingrad, Normandy, Midway, the Bulge. But for thousands of German prisoners of war, the moment of defeat didn't come on the battlefield. It came in front of a supermarket window. In 1944, those POWs saw bread stacked higher than their heads. They saw meat gleaming behind glass. They smelled coffee and sugar, luxuries their families back home hadn't tasted in years. Then came the ice cream, the Coca-Cola, the baseball games, the music, the laughter. It wasn't humiliation delivered by cruelty. It was humiliation delivered by normalcy. Because if this was how America treated its enemies, what did that say about how it treated its own? Germany had tanks, rockets, and soldiers drilled in discipline. But America had something stronger: factories that never slept, farms that never stopped producing, trains that never stopped moving, and supermarkets that never ran out of food. This was a war of ideology, yes, but it was also a war of supply, of comfort, of everyday life. And in that war, America's victory was absolute. Nazi propaganda promised that America was weak, soft, and crumbling. But the sight of a child licking an ice cream cone outside a small-town grocery store in 1944 destroyed that illusion. Because sometimes, the most devastating weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, it's proof. Proof that your enemy lives better in war than you do in peace. Historians later called it the arsenal of democracy. But for the men who lived it, America's greatest arsenal wasn't just tanks, planes, and ships. It was supermarkets. It was Coca-Cola. It was ice cream. It was the ability to make abundance look effortless. And that quiet power broke German morale in ways no battlefield could. Decades later, one former POW, interviewed as an old man, summed it up in a single line. "We lost the war the day we saw their supermarkets." And maybe that's the real lesson of World War II, that sometimes victory isn't decided only by armies and generals. Sometimes it's decided by the simple, undeniable power of bread on a shelf and the world it represents.